Well, as I mentioned these, next few weeks we're going to be thinking about the Advent season, that time of waiting, awaiting the first coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. We're looking back on that process of what it meant to look for the coming Messiah. And so I want to first look at this, what it meant to await the coming Messiah, by looking at probably a passage that we don't usually read in depth, passage we probably even skip over. It's the genealogy in Matthew. Probably doesn't get preached on a whole lot, and probably for good reason. It's a list of names. For those of you who have before been like the readers for the passage in church, you can be thankful that I'll be doing this reading. It's just a whole bunch of hard to understand names. So why read this? Well, this genealogy, I think, is going to teach us a lot about who Christ is by looking at the line that he came from. So pay attention to this list of names for any that you recognize, but I'm going to take a look at some of these strange outliers in this list. The names in this list that are outsiders and don't quite fit in, or shouldn't be put in a list of the king's genealogy. So follow along with me then in Matthew 1 through 17. It's the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. And Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. After the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abihud, and Abihud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor. And Eleazar the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud. And Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who was called Christ. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. This, even a list of names, is the word of the Lord. One thing that I've found to often be true, and any fans of books will probably agree with this, that movies don't always do books justice. Because when you're taking a longer book and condensing it into a 2-hour film or even a 3-hour film, you're having to make stylistic, narrative changes that might fit better with the point of the filmmaker. And often in the process, you might change events, you might change motivations for characters, things like that. One example that stands out to me is the character of Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings films. See, the Peter Jackson movies present Aragorn as a reluctant hero, someone who knows who he is but is reluctant to step up to his task. So if you're unfamiliar, Aragorn is a character who's heir to the throne of a nation called Gondor, but in the movies he is filled with self-doubt, with insecurity. And why is he insecure? Because he knows who his ancestors are. His ancestors were corrupt. And so he thinks that he as well is going to become corrupted. And he spends 2.5 very long films rejecting this title of king and pushing it off until eventually in the third movie, he accepts his calling to become king. Yeah, exciting character arc, right? But that's not what the books are like at all. See, in the books, you have a humble ranger, Aragorn, who knows exactly who he is right from the beginning. At precise times in the books, you actually get vivid, graphic glimpses of who he truly is, the rightful heir to the throne. There are these sudden flashes where his nobility and honor is revealed, and it's almost like a transfiguration kind of moment. And those moments of transfiguration for Aragorn always happens when he reveals his ancestry. He connects who he is by what line he's in. He shows his sword, which was a sword that once was broken and is now remade. And he seems to grow in stature and have this crown of light almost fall on his head. He's the king that the people have been waiting for. And yet when he first shows up in the story, he's wearing tattered and filthy clothes. He's dark and mysterious. And when he first shows up, he's holding half of a sword, the rest of it shattered into pieces. Forces you kind of ask as a reader when he first kind of reveals who he is, how can this outcast be a king? Either presentation, the movie or the book, are emphasizing his genealogy. One negatively saying, I can't be king because they're corrupt. The other positively saying, this is my line, and so this is why I'm noble. But yet in both instances, we meet the character as a humble, outcast person. See, the idea of a lineage of a king is important. And this is how we open Matthew's gospel. When Matthew is demonstrating who Jesus is, he starts with a list of names. Why does he start with a list of names? Because his point in this book is, this is Jesus who is the heir to this throne of David. He is the Messiah. Genealogies do tell us something, don't they? They tell us about who the person is. You want to know why this person is the way they are? Well, look at where they came from. You know, you might think about different little qualities, vocal tics that you have. Look at your parents. I've heard many times from people who have heard my father preach and have heard me preach and just noticed the striking similarities, just even a vocal tone. You want to know something about who someone is, look at their genealogy. So Matthew wants to show us who Christ is. And his Jewish readers would have a really good understanding of what Matthew's trying to do by listing these names. He's trying to show Jesus is king. Jesus comes from royal, important figures like Abraham, like David. Now, keep in mind, this list is not comprehensive. It doesn't take into account every single person. So what does that mean? Does that mean it's a false list? No. It is a very specifically put together list to draw a point to us. So every name that's in there is in there for a specific reason. So I'm not going to preach a sermon on every name, but I'm going to preach a sermon on the 4 strange names that are in there, because they're outsiders. They're names that you really wouldn't expect to see here. So first I want to look at, who are these outsiders? The first thing we're looking at is, who are these outsiders I'm talking about, these outliers that don't fit in? And secondly, looking at, why display them? So not only who they are, but why would they be displayed in this list that we're still looking at 2,000 years later? And finally, how, even just by displaying names that are outsiders, how are we commanded to love the outsiders? So, in verse 1, we get the simplest overview. You can kind of cut out most of it just by saying, Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's the path we're going to take, from Abraham to David to Jesus. That's the path here. It's a pretty impressive thesis, isn't it? Matthew is showing us that who Jesus is by perhaps like the 2 most important figures to the first century Jew. Abraham's the forefather of all Jews. and able to trace yourself directly to the line of Abraham is an important thing to boast about. But even more importantly here, he's also connecting himself to David. That's not just to show how much of a rightful Jewish man he is, but that he's also royal. He is the Messiah only if he can trace his lineage to David, the great king. One's family line proves just how important you are. So not only this, but Matthew shows that Jesus' genealogy is a kingly one. And you'll see a lot of numbering there at the end, about 14s. And without getting into it too much, it's doing a lot with 7. 7 times 2 is 14, and they do that 3 times. So that numbering is a very holy kind of righteous, royal kind of numbering that's why he numbers it the way he does right there. All that emphasizes right there is that Jesus, once again, even in the numbering of the list, is a holy, righteous king. No matter any way you look at it, this is a kingly genealogy, and it's emphasizing David. Jesus is the Messiah. Is the clearest point you can take away. And the rest of the sermon could just be on that. But I want to take a look at something we probably don't often think about in the Christmas time. And it's this. There are some interesting names that he drops in here. Because in verses 3 through 6, he drops in the names of 4 different women. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba. Bathsheba, whose name isn't even mentioned, it's mentioned by the wife of Uriah. Now, first of all, the inclusion of women in a genealogy, well, probably not unheard of at that time, is still an unusual thing to do. The women mentioned here are not mentioned even as the mother of, rather they're mentioned just in connection with the man that they had the son with. The emphasis on the whole genealogy is on the men, and that makes sense. Being in that culture, it was very focused on father to son. That's how birthrights and inheritance flowed. So the emphasis was father to son in that culture. Which makes you wonder ever more, why put the names of these women on there? Why be this specific? So the appearance of these women asks us not who are the men on this list, but rather who are these women that Matthew specifically selects to put in here. Well, quick overview of who these women are that Tamar first appears in Genesis 38, which is a chapter that's usually skipped in Sunday school. It's right around the narrative about Joseph, and we have this small little story about Judah, one of Joseph's brother, going down to Canaan and marrying a Canaanite wife and having sons, and a bunch of tragedies befall the sons as a result of their sinfulness. And one of Judah's daughters-in-law is Tamar. And she's been twice widowed now. She's lost her husband twice, Tamar has. And so she disguises herself as a prostitute so that she can have a child through Judah, her father-in-law. Maybe makes sense why it's often skipped in Sunday school. And then we have Rahab, who we see in Joshua 2. She was a Canaanite prostitute from Jericho, and she hid the Israelite spies and was saved along with her family because she placed her faith in Yahweh when he struck down the walls of Jericho. And by doing this, she becomes a part of the Israelite nation. She gets brought into Israel because of her willingness to hide the spies. Another outsider, non-Israelite. Ruth, she's got a whole book about her. And Ruth, if you remember, is not an Israelite either. She's a Moabite who lost her husband, but she stuck close to her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. And what did Ruth do? She left her homeland of Moab to go back to Jerusalem, a place she did not belong, to attempt to live off the leftovers of the fields, to just try to get whatever food she could picking off the fields. Very poor and vulnerable position. We see Moabite widow, perhaps the most vulnerable and unprotected kind of person, getting protection and food and a husband by God's provision. At At the end of that book, the book of Ruth, we learn that she's the great-grandmother of King David. And then the next woman that we're looking at is Bathsheba, who in this genealogy, like I said, doesn't even get her name mentioned. See, we read about her in 2 Samuel 13, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The wife of Uriah is Bathsheba, with whom David had an affair with, and had Uriah, her husband, killed so that no one would find out about his sin. Once again, it's a non-Israelite woman in the ancestry line, and she plays a key part in one of the ugliest and most sinful episodes of King David's life and choices. So why is she not even mentioned by name? Because I think Matthew's doing something very, very pointed here. By mentioning the fact that she was someone else's wife, Matthew's pointing out the sin of David. Great King David, and yet he is bringing right to the forefront his ugliest, most disreputable wrongdoing and sin. Stealing another man's wife and killing him to cover it up. Being the son of David is a statement that any proud Jew would like to make. But Matthew undercuts that greatness by reminding us of his sin. It's a strange list of 4 names to include here, isn't it? Why these 4 people? Why them? They're not Israelites. They don't fit in. Why mention them? In a list of patriarchs and kings and towering figures of Old Testament people, you can see we have some outliers, some outsiders on the list. First of all, there are 4 women. There are 4 non-Israelite women. They all have come from very vulnerable, oppressed parts of society with no social capital or standing, and all of them with some stained reputations. Parts of the story that are hard to talk about, that you'd rather ignore. So why include these names? Not only who are these outsiders, but why are we displaying them in this list of the Messiah? It's again where I'm going to remind you, this list is selectively put together. He knew exactly who he wanted to put in here to get the numbers to fit, to work through these generations. So why name these people? 2 Canaanites, a Moabite, the wife of a Hittite, non-Israelites. By doing this, we're tearing down the high title of David. So why? Doesn't this undo the entire case that Matthew would be trying to make? Doesn't this discredit who Jesus is? Why include these people? Well, obviously he's making a point. He's including names that we would normally want to, just sweep under the rug. Cover up, just like David tried to cover up his sin. It causes us maybe to ask ourselves, what are the things that we want to sweep under the rug? What are the things about our life, events, choices we've made that we would rather just cover up, not let anyone find out about or see? Are there things that you would rather avoid ever having mentioned again? Maybe just the thought, the mere remembrance of this moment keeps you up at night in fear, terror, and shame. Could have been something rude or cutting you said to someone that really did damage to them. Maybe it's how you know you've disappointed or hurt someone you love or respect. Maybe it's something you did just years and years ago, but it still haunts you to this day. And for the most part, maybe you do a good job covering it up and not thinking about it, but every once in a while, it comes back to mind. You feel that terror. Thinking, please don't let anyone find out what I said. Please don't let anyone find out what I did, what I saw, what I watched, but I allowed to happen. It fills us with fear because we think if this is found out, we'll only receive more and more shame than we're already feeling. It fills us with fear because we'll be separated from others. They'll look at me differently. They'll look at me as less than. They'll put up a barrier, put up a wall against me, see me as a gross, disgusting, selfish person. They'll cut me off. And you think about those secret, those hidden sins, those hidden things about your life, things that have happened to you even more, things that have happened against you, wrong things that have happened to you. Even then you feel isolated. Feel like those barriers are put up. You're outside. You're an outlier to everyone else. You know, if we were Matthew putting this list together, we'd probably feel similar shame about these names here being in our history. About these great men that we look up to and honor and the terrible things that they'd done. Why would we include the names that remind us of that? That bring poor reputation and sin into Jesus' lineage. Matthew includes them. Matthew keeps them in. Why? Because they are outsiders. They are sinful. They remind us of people who are looked down upon. They were needy and poor because they were used and abused by others, and they experienced humiliation. These are the people that Jesus came to save. If we're talking about why did Jesus come to earth during Christmas time, this is the point we need to understand first. These are the people that Christ works through. These are the people that are part of his history and therefore our history. These are the people that Christ transformed and declared righteous because by coming to earth to save outcasts and sinners, that's what the gospel's about. As Matthew begins his gospel, he is bringing that point front and center. Matthew tells us exactly who Jesus Christ is. Matthew gives an account of the names of Jesus' ancestors to show us God's mysterious ways. Because God is God that breaks through barriers. Those barriers of shame and fear that you feel are put up between you and others, that is exactly what God breaks through. And Jesus Christ saving us, coming towards us, he is destroying those barriers of sin and shame. And just by the presence of the names of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, we see God breaking down the barriers between men and women. It's not just men who are accredited and named in bringing about the Messiah, but God working through the lives of these important women. It prepares us to look ahead for the fifth woman that's mentioned in this list, Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's not by Joseph that Jesus is born, but by the Spirit coming upon Mary. More scandal in even her time. We have these two Canaanites, a Moabite, the wife of a Hittite, and a list of pure-blood Israelites. We see people living in simple situations of morality. It prepares to see how God and in Christ breaks through boundaries of gender and race, nationality, class, poor reputation. All of those things are what Christ breaks through because Jesus came to save sinners. And so what does that commend us to do? But show then love for the outsider. How do we look then at the outsider? How does this change the way we see them? Because understanding why Matthew puts these names in the genealogy of Jesus is something radically beautiful. How does it help us, though, in this Christmas season, this Advent season? Because it's not simply enough to remember that Christ came to save. It's not enough to remember that Christ did save, but it's not enough to remember just to consider the people whom Christ came to save, because it's a nice story. Stories are inspiring, yeah. They're comforting, even encouraging at times. But how does the story even of Jesus' genealogy actually change anything about my life? How do the mysteries of Advent bring joy and hope to your life right now in a time where there's very little joy to be had in the world around us? First, you have to look at this list and see yourself in it. Because we were once outsiders like Rahab, like Ruth, like Bathsheba or Tamar. Paul reminds us in Colossians 1:21 that Christ has reconciled us to him, that we were once alienated, we were hostile, but God's reconciled us, bringing us towards him. That language in Colossians there, I can't get any closer to the truth of what is happening in the lives of these Canaanite women, right? These people who are aliens to the Jewish people. They're a bunch of Gentiles like us. How are we a part of God's chosen people? How do we get to be included even though we are outliers, outsiders? But that's what God does. He breaks through those barriers. We should see ourselves not only as Christians, but people who on our own really have no place in God's people, yet are included because of what Christ did. It not only causes us to rejoice in how God has included us, but it transforms the way we look at others outside even the church. What people then would you never expect to enter into a church? Maybe it's someone who you know grew up in the church or since walked away in vocal and persistent opposition. You're not comfortable even reminding them of your faith because you don't want to endure another tirade of insults and harsh criticisms of the church. You can tell they're still holding on to a pretty high degree of anger and resentment towards the church. And they've made themselves then an outsider. But ask yourself, would God call them back? Maybe it's a coworker who's never set foot in a church and they've made it clear that they've got no intention to. Hearing them talk about religion just kind of makes you feel ignorant. Less intelligent, you think, I could probably never convince them to listen to me anyway. But could God still speak to them? Who in your community do you look at and consider an outsider of the church? Who do you doubt God would ever call to himself and redeemed? Is it the poor, those living in lower income neighborhoods? Maybe it's the extravagantly wealthy. Those in the LGBTQ community. Your Muslim or Jewish neighbor. Maybe you've identified them as outsiders and often unknowingly put up a barrier to them. We know people like this. I know we're kind, open, and probably truly loving, but do we stop yourself from communicating what God's done in your own life? Have you not let yourself share with them your personal experience because, well, they never even want to listen to me or come to my church. They never want anything to do with religion. Maybe you're right. But would you have wanted to be a part of this, apart from the work of the Holy Spirit? Would you have been included as the outsider you once were? This list of names tells us that we can't put our neighbors, our coworkers, our old friends, families into boxes of who will be included in God's church and who will be excluded. We don't get to put up our own barriers of inclusion and exclusion because God's always going to break through them to work out his salvation. God's grace, his ability to change the heart of a sinner doesn't follow the lines that we expect it to. People don't repent and turn to Christ because we've worded our argument carefully. God changes hearts. God works. Someone's background is not going to prevent them from being able to see what God has done. So I encourage you this season, work this into your prayer, that their story can be your story too. Pray through this, that as you confess your sin, confess that you once were alienated from God. You once were an outsider, an outcast, an outlier. But God has brought you in. That God would work in the hearts of those in your community, even those who you think their lives are a far cry from any Christian norm. Pray for those that you see, the drug user who would find the answer to loneliness and emptiness that they've been so desperately wanting to fill. A person who's turned their back on the church because of great harm that was done to them by those who called themselves Christians. The people that you'd be shocked to find out they jumped on our live stream or came to our church one day. But should you be shocked at this person having any interest? Because I'm here, and you're here listening. Why should we ever be shocked at who God calls to follow him? One thing that we should always be reminded of is how can we be called to loving those who are outsiders? You know, this list that we see here, these forefathers and foremothers of Jesus are not examples of perfect and faithful holy men and women. It's a recognizable list. It's also a checkered one. People like Bathsheba, who after had been taken into the king's bed, after she had lost her husband by the order of the king, and then having her newborn child die after all this sinful mess, Bathsheba, what hope was there for her? Talking about living in a time where it's hard to find any hope or joy in anything. That's what she lived through. The king of Israel, great King David, had caused immense harm and violence to her life. Bathsheba needed a good king. And the great king that was in front of her had abused her and harmed her. She needed a king who would welcome her and love her. She needed a king who had the rule and the power to take away all that was evil and broken in this world and not continue to perpetuate it. Could this wife of a Hittite hope for a king like that? But we see in this list that eventually that king would come. Jesus Christ, that answer is yes. In the messy and gritty and painful, lonely lives of outsiders, God works out his plan. So throughout this week, think what that means to us as Christians. That God did not get stopped by your sin, by your background, by what happened in your life. It didn't stop Christ from wanting to die for you. So let that story flow to the way you see others. That we should be a church that welcomes people in, not ignoring sin or brokenness, but knowing that there is an answer for it. We don't brush it aside. We deal with it. We confront it because there is an answer in Jesus Christ. Because Christ has dealt with it. He didn't sweep it under the rug, but he bore it on himself. The shame, the guilt, the sin. He bore it on himself. And because of that, we belong because Christ came for us. Us, outliers, us outsiders. Let's pray then today to our King who's done that for us.